Welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today we'll talk about API deprecation and sunsetting so that you don't get a flood of complaints when you shut down your APIs. Let's talk about how to deprecate and sunset APIs and best practices for doing that. Let's get out of here and to a safer place. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the API lifecycle and the specific parts of the API lifecycle I want to focus on today. The four things I want to talk about today is a little bit of a recap of the API lifecycle in general. Then I want to go into some details on why deprecation and sunsetting are two important parts of the lifecycle. Then I want to talk a little bit about how you can implement it on a technical level, so what these mechanisms actually can do for you. And then we'll also have a very brief look into implementation details, how you can actually get it done in the tools you might work with. So let's start by talking about the API lifecycle in general. We've discussed in other videos a fair bit that it's important to manage and treat APIs as products, meaning that an API is a product that you put out. It's something that somebody consumes and that somebody will start depending on. And it's important that you realize this fact and you manage that dependency responsibly, also from your side as a provider. And if you do it that way, you can make sure that you have a better relationship with your consumers. It becomes more predictable for your consumers. And generally speaking, what we call developer experience, meaning that the ability for developers to easily and safely use your API just becomes better. When you look at APIs and at products in general, then no product lives forever. Every product is something that gets introduced, then over time it maybe gets improved, and that at some point it will be retired because nobody wants it anymore or a better product gets released. And there's one thing that is really specifically important here that we discussed when we talked about APIs as a language. When you look at APIs as a language, the important part to understand here is that the language of the API gets built into machines, into computers. And then these machines start using the API, they start using the language. That means there is an ongoing relationship between the API provider and the API consumer. And because the machines are not particularly smart in figuring out when maybe a product may not be around anymore, or also what to do if the API will become deprecated at some point, it's good if you have a mechanism where you can warn the people who are managing the machines ahead of time, so that they don't have to find out that your API is going to be retired the hard way because at some point it just stops working. And this is where we get into the second part of this little video. The second part is about specifically deprecation and sunsetting and what these two concepts mean. The API lifecycle goes from idea, inception, prototyping, first usage, then hopefully getting more users, and then at some point you maybe come up with something else, or for some reason you decide, I don't want to make that API available anymore. What's the safe way to do that? And the safest way to do that is to have a mechanism from the very beginning, planning that from the very beginning, that allows you to say in a machine understandable way, this is the time when this API is not recommended anymore. You shouldn't start using it because it's not really the recommended API anymore. That's when you deprecate it and you say, this is still around, but it's not a good idea to start using it. And if you're using it, you should start looking for alternatives. And then the second thing is sunsetting, meaning that this is the time when you actually shut it down. And that's also something that you very likely should announce in advance so that people know what to expect, that they can look for alternatives, that they can start teaching their machines the new language that they have to switch to when your API goes down and they maybe switch to another one. So deprecation and sunsetting really are two important parts of lifecycle management. And now let's look a little bit more specifically into what the mechanisms that I'm presenting today allow you to do and why I think it's a good idea to consider using those mechanisms in your API design. Let's look at the two mechanisms that I would like to present today. They are both in the form of HTTP header fields, meaning that they show up in HTTP messages as header fields, and anybody consuming the API can recognize the presence of those header fields and react accordingly. What does that actually look like? So when you look at those header fields, they are both very simple. One of them is called deprecation and the other one is called sunset, and they're both defined in very similar ways. The differences really are purely historical and syntactical. So they're both defined basically to be timestamps. And that timestamp means when is that event going to happen. For deprecation, the timestamp can be in the future, announcing an upcoming deprecation, or it can be in the past, saying that this API is actually not the recommended version anymore. It has been deprecated back then. So that allows you to understand that the API is still around, but maybe you shouldn't start depending on it. For sunsetting, the timestamp always will be in the future because the timestamp says this is when the API will be shut down. But in both cases, the timestamp allows you to understand how those final parts of the life cycle, the deprecation phase and the final sunsetting, how those happen and when they happen, and you can do something to prepare. Now you might ask yourself, how does that work? How does it help for these informative messages showing up in HTTP header fields? And that's a good question. And there's two important answers to that. One is that you can use these header fields to inform maintainers of the application. So you can write it into log files, you can raise alarms, you can send emails, you can do whatever makes sense in a way that allows somebody to take action. And both specifications, both the deprecation and also the sunsetting specification, also define link relationships, meaning that what you can do as a provider of an API, you cannot just publish that timestamp. You can also include a link with that relationship type, either deprecation or sunset, and that link then can link to an informative resource. The specification doesn't really say how that has to look like, but very likely it would be a web page or a document that documents a little bit what's going on. So why is the API deprecated? What are maybe possible replacements? Is there anything else you can do to make the process a little less painful? So that's something that if you are responsibly managing your API product, that helps you to better manage the relationship with your consumers, and that makes your consumers more happy, and it makes the overall ecosystem of API consumers and API providers more robust. This is the general idea of how this can work. Now let's look into how you can make that work in a very simple scenario. And the simplest scenario I could come up with is something that is actually on your computer by default. In that case, I have a Mac, so it's on my Mac. But I'm not using any additional software. I'm just using the mechanisms that are built into the Mac to show you a little bit how this could look like. And what we're doing is we're using the built-in web server, which is an HTTP server. And we're looking at the header fields it produces, and then we're tweaking the configuration and we look again. So in this demo, we're using a command to access the local web server. And then we ask it for its start resource, so to speak, for the homepage. And we get a couple of header fields as a response. And then we go into the server configuration. And we jump to the section where we can add a configuration that says, always add this header field to your responses. And that response is something you would add probably when you know that you're going to shut your service down. So you make this information available from now on. And then we have to restart the server to make it reread the changed configuration. And then when we go back to our terminal window and we contact the server again and we issue the same command, we ask for the start resource, then you see that now the sunset header field is actually part of the response. We have now made this information available to whoever is requesting that resource. In reality, that is probably not what you will do. It's more likely that you would have code doing this, but I wanted to show you a very simple way how you can try it out on your own computer if you feel like it, without having to do anything special, without actually having to do any coding. You can just do it by configuration. My recommendation also would be to not directly add this in code, but to add a configuration to your API from the very beginning, saying that whenever I know when I'm going to shut down my API, I can just add this little piece of information to my configuration file for my API, and then this sunset header will start showing up, and the same is what you can do for the deprecation header as well. If you do it like this, then from the very beginning, also in your coding practice, you make clear that you're planning to use these header fields to be nice to your consumers, and you make it very easy for people maintaining the API to actually make that change when they get to those stages where they say, okay, now we're going to deprecate those API, or now we're going to shut down this API. They don't really have to touch the code. All they have to do is change a little bit of configuration, and that's all they have to do. Another possible configuration pattern would also be to say, I don't do it in my API at all. But if you're using a little bit more advanced things such as an API gateway, an additional level of API management that often is used when companies have larger API ecosystems, then you can also add this information in your API gateway, meaning that you don't have to change the API at all. All you have to do is in your API gateway, you have to add a policy that says for this API from now on, always add the deprecation header or the sunset header. And then this is something the gateway will actually put into the traffic. And that is one of the advantages of using a gateway, that you can do these kind of API management things in your gateway, and you don't have to go back and do it in each API individually. So that last pattern with the API gateway is probably something that is interesting when you are having more APIs and you really think about, how do I manage this kind of API lifecycle in my entire environment? And then this kind of thing can become something that you don't have to ask each team to do. Instead, that becomes something that you deliver basically through the available infrastructure, and that becomes a practice then that also becomes very coherent throughout your landscape, which is very useful for consumers because they can rely on the fact that you will tell them when an API is deprecated or is going to be shut down, and they can prepare, and everybody's hopefully happy. And that's really it. That's all I wanted to say about API deprecation and sunsetting. It's a specific facet, let's say, of API lifecycle management, but I think it's one that sometimes gets a little bit forgotten because, well, if you just get started, why would you think about what to do when you want to shut down your API? But I think it's just a question of responsible product management. It's really something that should become part of your general approach to how you design and deliver APIs. It's not a lot of work. It's just something that you have to keep in mind to do. And you can either do it individually, like I showed you in the demo, or you can do it on the landscape level in the API gateway, as I described. But it should be something that should become part of the general way how you manage API products. You can think of it really in the end, right? You can think of it like expiration dates on products. It's the same thing. If you go to the supermarket, you expect each product to have an expiration date because that's important for you. You want to know. And even if you know that some products have a very, very long shelf life, it's still something that makes you, I would say, happier and feel safer as a consumer when you know that all these things are managed in that way. And if something bad is going on, you found something way in the back of the shelf that had been sitting there forever, you can find out and you can deal with that safely. So it's really the same thing. It's kind of a safety precaution, and it's something that makes consumers feel safer and happier. And therefore, I think it really is a good idea. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. This was the last video in a series of videos that I had about API Lifecycle Management. If you're interested in the more general ones, please go back and check my channel. You'll find them there. I'll link them from the description. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like my videos in general, please subscribe. And I hope to see you soon. Bye.